Today, the second game of the fourth round of the FIDE World Cup was played. Remember, 16 players battling it out still to get to the next round, and ultimately the top two players in the tournament will qualify for the Candidates Tournament next year. I thought the most interesting game today was played between Wesley So and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, two young players who've been floating around the top 10 for the past year or so, and this was a good battle. Remember, their first game was drawn, and in this second game, Wesley So had miscalculated. He'd lost a piece, but he's managed to arrive into an endgame where he has rook and 4 pawns against rook, knight and 2. Very difficult to determine whether this is a theoretical win for the knight. Let's see how the game went. Rook c1 check. And rook c2. So the rook stations itself on the second rank. That's good news. And now knight f8. So Maxime is now redeploying this knight to a better square. Maybe f6, maybe e6, maybe somewhere else. h4 from white. One of the defender's problems in this kind of position is where to put the pawns. Should you stick or should you twist? Should you advance them or should you just stay where they are, leave them where they are and not create any weaknesses? I don't think h4 is a problem, but it's where to position the other pawns. And yeah, the problem is pawns can't move backwards. Sorry to state the obvious, but once you've committed them, there's no going back. So the king just tucks itself away, and who knows, it might advance up the board. And now Wesley decides on a particular defensive formation. He realizes that black is about to swing this knight round to attack the f2 pawn, and he decides to put his rook on the f-file to defend this pawn. There are other methods, but okay, it's an interesting one. And here Maxime played knight c5. I think he could also play knight f6. I think this is quite an interesting move, actually. Perhaps with the idea h5. And if g4, h5 anyway is interesting. And if pawn takes, then the king advances, black collects this pawn, and now the h-pawn is isolated. Or if g5, then the knight comes into g4. Okay, this is also very committal from black's viewpoint, but I think knight f6 is certainly a possibility. Anyway, he played knight c5. So he's going into d3 to attack the f2 pawn, and of course the king steps aside, and this is the point of putting the rook on f5. It also means it's very hard for black to activate the king. So, there are good reasons for playing the rook to the f-file. Now, how on earth does black make progress here? Because basically the one weakness in white's position has been securely defended by king and rook, and what else do the rook and knight do? Well, the only thing to do is to try and somehow take advantage of the fact that this rook has very few options now. So the rook gives a check and maintains its position on the f-file, and king g7. And here is a crunch moment in the game. After just 7 seconds, Wesley played g5 here, which looks completely natural to maintain the rook on f6, looking at the g6 pawn, keeping the king shut in, and also defending that f2 pawn. But maybe there was a better move. Rook a6 is a very, very unusual move, in that it allows black to take this pawn in 2 different ways, and I can understand why Wesley probably didn't even seriously consider this move. The idea is to give the rook checking distance and then just to hassle the king. Of course, black can retreat the rook to protect the king, but then that takes all the pressure off white's position. But of course the critical moves are, well, what happens if this is taken? He might well have considered this, but maybe didn't see the next move. If rook d6, then knight c5 is a very good move. Nice tactic here. But if we just go back, this is a very clever move, rook a3. If you check straight away, then of course the rook blocks. But the point is that instead of checking, first of all you play rook a3. Of course, if the knight moves, then the rook drops, so rook d2, and then you check like crazy. And the king doesn't have any cover, and the pawns are too weak. Knight f2 is interesting. Again, this is really on the edge. This is critical. You keep checking like crazy, and the only way for black to make progress is to give up this pawn. Black still has an attack, but probably white is good enough here to make a draw. Anyway, Wesley played g5. Looks like a very natural move, but let's see what happens. h5. Black has to keep pawns. You'll soon see how important it is to keep that h-pawn. And here I was thinking, because in the game Wesley played f3, and I was thinking, well, maybe white should just sit tight here, but I think there's a good way for black to make progress. I mean, there are various lines, but I think this is a reasonable move, to attack this pawn, and the basic idea is this: rook comes to f5, and this endgame is actually completely winning for black. I know it looks a bit scary with this passed pawn, but actually the knight basically hops back here, keeping white's king pegged to the h-pawn, and then the king comes around and into the position. It's actually completely winning for black. So I don't think king g2 is good. f3 was played anyway in the game. And now e4 is necessary to block the rook out. Well, e4 is going to have to be played at some moment. It's, white can't keep hold of both these pawns. And now black brings the knight back to e5. The problem is this rook is running out of squares. If, for example, rook f4, well, this position is Zugzwang. There's no good move here, and then the rook has to go to f6 and you lose a pawn. So king g2, white can only wait, but rook c6 forces the exchange of rooks. Right, so now we come to the next phase of the game. It looks extraordinary that black can win this, but in fact he can. Let me show you what might happen if white rushes forward. Again, this looks as though white should make a draw. In fact, it's a very easy win. The knight comes round, white's king is tight at the h-pawn, and now it's just Zugzwang. So easy. So white has to, for the moment, just hold the pawns, and black brings the king round. Again, f5 just isn't any good at all. Black is going to be able to get a blockade. So white waits, and black waits too. Now, just for a moment, Vachier-Lagrave was a little bit unsure. He went round in circles a couple of times, and they arrived actually at the same position they had a few moves before. And here, Maxime finds a beautiful way to make progress. He redeploys the knight to its perfect square, which is d6. We'll see why in a second. Obviously, if the e-pawn advances, then that's not good. So here the idea is basically just to push the king back. So the knight attacks the pawn, so the king has to stay on the third rank, it can't come back. And now if it shifts over, then the king will follow, and you can see black is making progress. So it's at this moment that white has to make a break. He played f5, and this looks so scary with black's king across the other side of the board. And here, if this is taken, then white is fine. After this, and white can draw. The only move to win is knight e8. I mean, this is absolutely brilliant. Seen so far ahead by Vachier-Lagrave. If f6, well, this knight performs miracles. It comes to c7. So it can always come to e6, and then the king is forced away, and black wins. So this was taken, and now knight g7 is the perfect position. Basically, it holds everything, and it prevents white's king coming forward. Black's pieces work so efficiently. They work so well together. And here, well, white just has to give ground, or give a pawn, or give ground. So Wesley gave away this pawn. If this is taken, then in fact white is more than fine there. But instead of taking, the king comes back to take the pawn. So that knight maintains control over f5. It's just the perfect blockader. So the king comes back to take the pawn, and again white's king can't really make any progress. King e8, this is a beautiful move. If king f6, then now the king has to go back, and slowly the king comes backwards. Well, in the game king d5 was played, and in this position actually white resigned. So if king e5, well, we're back to this position, the king goes backwards, black comes forward, and you can see that slowly but surely white's king goes back. You can take this pawn, and then, well, the knight comes round. Black is going to squeeze white out of the way and take all the pawns. Just the most beautiful technical win by Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. He really is an expert at these kind of technical endgames. I mean, this was a study-like finish. And I don't think it's any coincidence that actually Maxime has spent a lot of training hours solving endgame studies. This is his real strength of his. He has many strengths, but this one really is a forte. Well, so Maxime Vachier-Lagrave goes through to the next round. Other players that went through today, Peter Svidler, who drew with Topalov, so he goes through. He won their first game. Nakamura goes through. He drew solidly against Adams today and goes through because he won the first game. And Mamedyarov goes through. Again, he drew solidly against Caruana. So Mamedyarov pushes out one of the big favourites, Fabiano Caruana. 4 games go into the tiebreak tomorrow. Wojciech and Giri, Karyakin and Andreikin, Wei Yi and Ding Liren, and Elyanov and Yakovenko. Tiebreaks tomorrow is going to be very exciting.